Well, good afternoon, and it's great to see so many people here again this afternoon, and to see so many people that I've known, I suppose, for the last 19 years, in particular since 2000, when we had the great Ruskin centenary, the conferences, the exhibitions. And it seems now, in 2019, a good moment to pause and to think about the things that, as a group, we have achieved and been discussing since 2000, and in fact over the last, say, 50 years, because I know some people in the room have been thinking about Ruskin and working with Ruskin for 50 years or more. And so I've been very privileged this year to have conversations, to interview many people who have been part of the Ruskin movement since 1969, and to bring those together in another new book, which some of you might have seen, called The Ruskin Revival, which is I've been working with Robert Hewison on that. So some of the things that I might be talking about today overlap a little bit with some of the ideas that he presented to us so eloquently last night. And I thought, how can you bring together all the achievements of people in this room, people across the world, in different institutions, in different personal projects, in any way that makes sense in half an hour? So I thought one way to consider Ruskin's legacy since 1969 is to think about those things which are permanent, those things which are institutional, those sort of the stones, the things that have brought us to a particular place, or to a particular group of objects. And then to think also of the budding, the growing, the blossoming, the changing things, which Ruskin gestured towards all the time. The lilies that seem to blossom all the way through his writings, and in what he draws, and in the way that he expresses himself as to us, how we should be growing ourselves as we read with him and walk with him. So my starting point for the work that I've done was 1969 and two very contrasting moments. The moment when a group of scholars, some of whom are here, a group of scholars got together at Brantwood, that sort of physical relic of Ruskin, his last formal home, the place where some of his things still remained, and they gathered for a conference organised partly by James Dearden and partly by Lord Lloyd, as he became, who were managing, looking after those relics, the manuscripts, the diaries, the drawings, and also the physical house of Brantwood. And in 1969, March 1969, very, very cold conference where apparently there was ice inside the windows. But it doesn't sound as though people went to bed much, even if they did go up to their rooms and find the ice. They were up drinking and talking, and then out into the countryside, all around the lakes, following the progress of Ruskin in his Itinerariad, that sort of very young poem that he writes. And this moment of gathering, which is a great starting point. And I'll try and tease out some of those themes that came from that. But the other moment in 1969, almost simultaneous, is the death of one of the earliest Ruskinians, the death of Cuthbert Quayle, who was living in Ruskin Land. Ruskin Land, which is that patch of earth outside Bewdley in the Black Country, that patch of land put aside and saved for people to go back to as a retreat, as a space for contemplation, as a space for working. And Cuthbert Quayle was one of the last remnant of the generation just before the First World War, who'd come out of Liverpool. He'd come out of Liverpool with his family as a very young man and settled there, and had maintained that tradition of being in the countryside with Ruskin in mind. So you had the end of that kind of personal relationship directly back to a real memory of Ruskin as a person, and moving to the idea of establishing Ruskin as a field for study, which is what we're doing now. And that idea of trying to wrestle with how you maintain somebody as a kind of a concrete object for study, and yet allow that study to flourish and develop in all these different ways, through the Guild, through the libraries, through exhibitions and displays. And it struck me that thinking about Bewdley, thinking about Ruskin Land, there is that moment in 1877 when Ruskin himself is asked about what to do with an ancient church just outside Bewdley. This ancient church, should it be restored and all the traceries copied and made good and made tidy? What should we do with it? And Ruskin said very clearly, he said, you should leave the old ruin to grow grey by the Severn River. You should step away from it and then build something new, something to show what we're doing now. And so all the way through the last 50 years, there's been that kind of tension between, trying to maintain the stones and trying to build in a new way something fresh, something to show what we are learning from Ruskin. And Ruskin, of course, always leads the way in this, even in a work like this, which we were very fortunate to show in our recent exhibition at York Art Gallery, Ruskin, Turner and the Storm Cloud. We borrowed this from the Ashmolean. And the exhibition, if you've got a moment to go up to the Lake District, if you're heading back towards Brantwood in the next couple of weeks, the exhibition is still on at Abbott Hall in Kendal until the 5th of October. And you'll be able to see this and many beautiful watercolours and drawings there. But this idea that Ruskin encapsulates in this work showing a rock, showing a metamorphic rock. So as part of drawing it, he's showing how it came into being. It is not a static rock. However much it looks like it's fixed, there's an impermanence, a fragility woven into his drawing of this rock. The fact that all these little plants have got their footholds in there are growing out of that rock. And we can name and identify each one. And then, of course, the water flowing beneath it and the eddies of the water cutting away at the rock. So nothing is as fixed as we might like to think it is. And these ways of thinking have, I hope, been expressed throughout the last 50 years in the different institutions, the different organisations who've been working with Ruskin's legacy. One of the great changes in our interpretations of Ruskin, our thinking about Ruskin, has been the movement of his objects from widespread personal and private collections into institutions, into places where they are going to be kept in close archives, where they're going to be conserved, where they're going to be catalogued and digitised. And works like these daguerreotypes, which are now in the Ruskin Library at Lancaster, are things which have taken on a whole new life, which were quite personal and private things in Ruskin's lifetime and were part of that great dispersal in the 1930s when the objects in Brantwood were sold or given away. And of course, we know that from the moment that Ruskin began to make things, photographs, drawings, books, there was always a sense from him that they would go out. They would never be in permanent, fixed places, that he would give them to his friends. He would give them to the Ashmolean or the Fitzwilliam. He would give them to students. And these things are sort of with us for a moment and then can go and be seen in other ways. And so the possibilities for digitisation, which I'll return to, are extraordinary. But these daguerreotypes and the other works of focusing on the geology, which he loved, and his first love, as he says, was geology. Not looking at paintings, not looking even at the sculpture or the clouds above his head, but the process of how the earth is formed and how it changes. And of course, glaciers are the great example of how the earth is constantly changing. And they've been brought into our focus in the last couple of years through relationships between these objects, which have been made open to us through places like the Ruskin Library in Lancaster, and the relationships that are then developed with new artists. We were very fortunate in York to be able to work with a Royal Academician, Emma Stibben, who usually works in monumental drawings, in making big ink works. And she loves working with volatile landscapes, with landscapes that are constantly changing, like volcanic landscapes. She's gone to the Antarctic, she's spent a lot of time in Hawaii, but she said that she also knew the area around Mont Blanc very well. And so she was able to work using the daguerreotypes as a base. And you have to remember, of course, that all these things are very small. These daguerreotypes are tiny. You were so fortunate now to be able to see them in this extraordinary way, on this extraordinary scale. So she like so many of us, wanted to follow in Ruskin's footsteps and to go back to the places and stand in the place where he had been. And this moment, standing on the edge of the Mer de Glace, which Ruskin experienced in 1854, and she went back to last summer, and the ice has all gone. This is what is left. Well, there is nothing left of the ice that Ruskin would have known. And so we can use these geological examples that he loved and cared for and thought about and tried to understand and got into arguments and difficulties with other scientists, and his forebodings about what was happening with the storm cloud of the 19th century. And we can engage with them directly. And these things are all part of a new way of thinking about Ruskin's world, of following, as I said, in his footsteps, which began in 1969 when that group of scholars were literally sitting in Ruskin's dining room, were looking at his view, were following his path around the lakes and trying to engage with him on a personal and a textual level. And these things are being explored constantly in new ways. But there have been some great changes, as I hope we're already experiencing just by the things I've shown you, great changes in what the nature of Ruskin scholarship looks like. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you because I don't have a good enough image of it, but there is a wonderful photograph of most of the people who are at the Brantwood conference, and they are all men. Every single one of them. James Dearden is there, and Lord Lloyd is there, and Robert Hewison is there wearing a pair of extraordinarily red shoes. And these things are, of their moment. But there are very few women in that group, even those who are not in the picture. There were none in the picture, and there were very few in that group, except Rachel Trickett and Catherine Williams, and a few named people who couldn't quite make it, like Virginia Surtees. But there is a sense with people like Emma Stibben engaging with this work, and people like us engaging with this work, that there is a shift, a very dynamic shift in Ruskin studies. And what I will want to unpick that idea of Ruskin and gender as being an important factor in a few moments. But getting back to geology, getting back to the problems of the land, the stones that Ruskin asks us constantly to engage with, this has been an element that has been sort of bypassed in many studies until recently, even though Ruskin himself insists that stones are part of his discussion of what the world is made up of and what we should look at constantly. And stones are held up to us as things that are worthy of looking at because they can tell us so much about our own perceptions, our own assumptions, and we can perhaps then start to unpick those assumptions. This is one of the stones that he gave away, again, a diamond that he gave away. And as we've discussed already at some length, the elements of drawing, the textbook that he gives to us all to teach us to draw. He holds up a stone in front of us and says, we should make no assumptions about what a stone should look like. And in one of those sort of tour de force pieces of language, he explains how a stone may be round or angular, may be polished or rough, cracked all over like an ill-glazed teacup, or as united and broad as the breast of Hercules. It may be as flaky as a wafer, as powdery as a field puffball. It may be knotted like a ship's hawser, or kneaded like hammered iron, or knit like a Damascus sabre, or fused like a glass bottle, or crystallized like hoarfrost, or veined like a forest leaf. Look at it, and don't try to remember how anybody told you to do a stone. And this idea of the variety, the possibility, the complexity, I think is what Ruskin has always offered to us, that we do not have to follow one idea of what Ruskin might be, one idea of what his interest in geology might be. We heard this morning this extraordinary ability to read passages from the Stones of Venice in multiple ways, as personal, as community works. And I think that is one of the reasons why we all keep coming back to Ruskin is that we can find our own way into his writing and find ourselves in all that different pile of stones. Which one do we want to be? Probably not the flaky one, but all the other possibilities of being a stone. And this idea of coming back to geology, which has been slightly sidestepped until very recently, now comes back into focus, partly thanks to Louise Pullen and her team in Sheffield, who made the most beautiful display of geological specimens at 2 Temple Place. And in fact, one of the newspaper art critics said that was the best thing in the exhibition. Not the drawings, not the sort of possible Titian, but the collection of stones. And here we have a really new collection of stones, well, an old and new collection of stones, which have come back to Brantwood, their old home, and which Howard Hull and his team are now trying to work out how best to look after these stones. They were Ruskin stones. These are the things that Joan Agnew, before she was married, used to sit and polish and label with him and talk to him about. And these are the sort of things that he would have used as a handling collection for the young women who he discussed geology with in Ethics of the Dust. And so the idea of stones as being equally valuable to him as lilies, I think we can now start to reintegrate into our discussion of what Ruskin might be. And of course, so many of us come at Ruskin through the stones of Venice, through perhaps reading William Morris and his insistence that the nature of Gothic, that central chapter, is the thing, the way in to understanding Ruskin. And to see that constant counterpoise between the natural and the carved, between the thing that is growing and the thing that is fixed, that we see in all these extraordinary illustrations that he makes. And we've also seen, of course, already yesterday, this amazing way of turning a leaf into a carved capital. So these things have been known to many people, those who read Ruskin in the 19th century and looked at those wonderful illustrations as they came out in their various forms. But there is a moment in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century where Ruskin's reputation takes such a dip, such a nosedive, that it is actually quite difficult for people to access Ruskin, except through very old copies of his books. The things that are being reprinted are few and far between. And even up until only 20 years ago, the possibility of getting an abridged version, a kind of pocket version of the Stones of Venice, was impossible until David Barry made his edited version. Even that is not really pocket size, it's still a bit of a doorstop, but it's a way in, it's a way to carry Ruskin with you. And this idea of how people now access Ruskin has been very important. And there was a time, and you think back to the Edwardian period, the people like Cuthbert Quayle, when it would have been, as Kenneth Clark says, for almost 50 years, to read Ruskin was accepted as proof of possession of a soul. The idea that everybody who was anybody read Ruskin, but it fell out of favour. And even Kenneth Clark, struggle as he might, found it difficult to keep Ruskin alive. But by the opportunities for digitisation, the opportunities for new photography, the opportunities for weaving together the natural world and the built world that he was focused on so often, we are now able to open up to people who don't have access to the 39 volumes in their library at home or in their library at their university, because of course many universities are starting to divest themselves of these great heavy works. So there's been a series of activities beginning with the Venetian notebooks, Ruskin's Venetian notebooks, from 2007 to digitize and to see how Ruskin's mind starts to work. And then we can really get to grips with him in new ways. And of course now it is possible, thanks to work at the University of Lancaster, to carry the complete works in your handbag. The entire works have been digitized and are searchable. There was a a quotation that I was trying to find just a few minutes ago, and I was thinking, how on earth can I find it? It's in my head, but I can't reach it. How can I reach it? And you can go back, and if you can remember vaguely where it is, in which volume, then it's there. You can find it. This is a marvellous tool, which has only been available to us in the last 10 years or so. And trying to make people aware of the possibilities of digitisation through things like there's the Stones of Venice, the Venetian notebooks, things like the elements of drawing, which is a great resource from the Ashmolean Museum, which includes all of their works like these that are there in the collections, but they're too fragile to be seen on a regular basis. I mean, our exhibition in York, we would have loved to keep it going for longer. So many people wanted to see these watercolours and drawings that we had on display. But they have a limited shelf life, as it were. You can only keep them out for maybe a maximum of 6 months in the year. So we had them for 3 months, Kendall has got them for 3 months, and then they're going to go back into their Solander boxes, and they won't be visible again until the conservators say it's okay to take them out. But we can enjoy them in new ways and share them in new ways through the very complex cataloguing and photography processes of these institutions. And that, I think, is an extraordinary resource for us. So to come away a little bit from the Stones and think more about the Lilies, about the possibilities for growth, about the possibilities for change, about the possibilities for changing our attitude directly to Ruskin in particular. Because it's extremely difficult when we're reading what Ruskin says about flowers and the way he presents, say in Proserpina, when he presents in 1875 his studies of wayside flowers. Wayside flowers found among the Alps and in Scotland and England, the Scotland and England which my father knew. So even in the title of Proserpina, it becomes a memory, it becomes an association with something personal, and it comes with a very particular sort of view of what these flowers should be and might be. And so studies like these of the field lily and the field narcissus, these are things that are often overlooked. They're the things by the wayside. They're not the big blousy garden flowers. These are flowers which are to one side of what we normally see. And that is his great virtue in his presenting these lilies of the field, that they are not something that is usually a focus of study. They are beautiful in their own right in the way he's drawn them, but they also allow him to educate in other ways. And this book, Proserpina, was of course written with Rose Latouche in mind, and many of his grammars were written with the young women that he met, with them in mind. And so this brings us to the problem of Ruskin and gender in the last 50 years, which we cannot overlook. And when we see works like this, which we had a look at earlier today, the study of Carpaccio that he made, the copy of Carpaccio that he made to have in front of him, that there are ways of reading it which are art historical and objective in some way, art critical, and there are ways of reading it which are deeply personal. And when he's writing about flowers, so often this is bound up with his writing about gender. When he writes Sesame and Lilies, the lilies are, expressing what he thinks about women, and particularly girls' education. And it's fascinating to think about how the reception of that has changed over the last 50 years. So a work like this is bound up with, yes, his fascination with Carpaccio, but also his obsession, his fixation, his concern for the dead young woman, Rose Latouche, who takes the place on the bed, very often in his head, of Ursula, as he slips in and out of what he calls his dreamy scatterment and bewilderment. And this problem of how we read what's going on the page and what's happening in his mind has become, again, increasingly a focus for scholars and for studies. And he looks at a work like this, and he tells us that, in some of his letters, he tells us that on Christmas Day, 1876, he writes, "Last night, St. Ursula sent me her dianthus, out of her bedroom window with her love. And there is the dianthus. So this plant has become associated in his mind very closely. He does find a potted plant as a Christmas present, and he associates it with his fixation, his love of Rose Latouche. And of course, this is all bound up now with our questions about Ruskin and his personal life. I mean, I'm part of that problem, I suppose, as well as part of the solution by focusing on Effie Gray in my biography of her. But it really, you know, the thing kicks off with someone like Kate Millett, who writes in Sexual Politics directly about Ruskin and his essay of Queen's Gardens. And her interpretation of Queen's Gardens sort of became a set text for generations of women and of men who wanted to think about the 19th century, wanted an idea of what the 19th century thought about women. And so much of what Ruskin writes in that does read quite badly if you take it out of context. That he writes about women who were made to be the helpmate of men. He writes about true wifely subjection. He writes that women's power is for rule and not for battle, for ordering, arrangement, and decision. And if you take these things out of context, it does sound fairly damning, particularly when you relate it to his very close and questionable at times relationship with Rose Latouche, the pressure he put on her, her mental health problems, his mental health problems. What I have come to read in this, and largely thanks to people like Dinah Birch who have turned it around, is that he offers all these kind of apparently straightforward, separate sphere ways of thinking about women and men. They have their separate spheres, and women are described as delicate, they're described as flowers, they're described as for ordering and decision. But when you start to realise that he is setting this up in order to come crashing through it and undermine it by saying women, young girls need to be taught languages, they need to be taught history, they need to have better teachers than their brothers, they need to have access to libraries, they need to have physical education in order that they can be lovely and happy. But he's giving them, and this is in 1865, so 3 years before the first public suffrage movement gathering of any sort. It's incredibly early. He is giving women the tools to transform their lives. But he's framing it in this way that shows them off as delicate flowers. And even better than that, the tools are not for themselves alone. These are tools for women's mission to women. That is the fundamental point. That when he talks about young women being like flowers that go out in the morning, or the gardener who goes out in the morning to her garden to play with the fringes of the guarded flowers and lift their heads when they are drooping. He is not talking about women as being enclosed in this garden. He's talking about women stepping out and helping those who are vulnerable, helping those on the edge. And he points directly to women and says, how can you bear it? How can you bear to walk past those feeble florets lying with their fresh leaves torn and their stems broken? Yes, these are women described as flowers. These are fallen women described as flowers, but it is women's mission to women that he is advocating. But yet, he couches it in terms that could not truly have offended the people around him. And that, I think, is one of his great offerings to us now, that he does enable women to think and speak and be here now. And we do have to question, to a certain extent, his relationship with Jones7. You know, why does he write to her in these extraordinary sort of baby talk ways? And thank you to Rachel Dickinson for working out what those letters meant, working out how they relate to other things in his life. And we do have to listen for the gaps in what Jones7 says. She may be safeguarding the girls who come to Ruskin. She's always seen as a gatekeeper, but whether we see her as somebody who keeps people away from Ruskin for his own sake, or occasionally for their own sakes when he gets, he is mad at the end of his life. He does lose his inhibitions. There may be times when she needs to just usher people out of the room, and we have to allow for these gaps in our understanding. But this idea of the girls dancing in the garden around Ruskin, the girls who are there to learn to be able to enjoy the natural world. So much of what he encourages them to do is to step outside their homes and step into the garden, into nature, is of course carried forward now in these wonderful projects that are still happening and are gathering speed in places like Ruskin Land, in the Wire Forest. And yes, this may be going at an old-fashioned pace in one way, but that idea of going back to the land is still incredibly important for young people from Manchester, for example, who come out of the city centre and learn to make things out of wood with their hands and learn to press apples and to communicate with each other and to communicate with the natural world, to listen to birdsong. One of the things I was able to do as part of the exhibition was to go and make a sound recording in Ruskin Land and listen to the woodworking tools and listen to the water and listen to the goldfinches and to bring these things, back into our gallery. So there are these extraordinary events that have happened in the last 12 months. This idea of gathering momentum, of coming to a point in 2019, the museum of the near future, looking forward, the idea of what we can do next, and the extraordinary effort of Sandra Kemp and her team in raising over £8 million to secure all those things which were dispersed and have been brought back together. And this idea of making something solid, but with a piercing through it, so you can see right to the heart of it. So it is both a secure space, a safe space, a tabernacle, but also you get this wonderful line of sight through to the daguerreotypes. So that's one way of thinking about what the stones mean now. Built around the idea of the stones of Venice. How do you create, as Richard McCormack has here, how do you create a building that is reminiscent of Venice and yet not pastiche, which is safe and yet welcoming? All these things are absolutely remarkable. And this which was one of the great sort of opening bids of the Heritage Lottery Fund money, shows what can be done when the money is directed in the right way. But I want to just sort of finish with other ways of thinking about what has happened in the last 50 years. And here are some of my colleagues who have been working over the last 10, 15, 20 years to bring Ruskin to many, many different communities. We have Sally at the top there with the Dexter cows, and I'm sure there are various people in the room that you will recognise. And this is the transformation, that this conference, there are more women speaking than men, which is extraordinary. I think in most academic fields that is extraordinary. And that shows that women are not put off by Ruskin's reputation. They are encouraged by Ruskin's words. And I want to finish with looking at one of the most influential women, who sadly I never got to meet, but who has transformed Ruskin's place and the place of Brantwood and made it fruitful, made it peaceful, made it beautiful. And that's Sally Beamish, who sadly died last year, and who was an inspiration in the way that she revisited Ruskin's garden. She's been described as having looked closely at the evidence of the soil itself, and this idea of taking nothing for granted, of always looking at what you have in front of you and working with it and responding to it. And in particular, there's a new space that she created, an enclosed garden, this sort of garden that Ruskin imagines in Queen's Gardens, that enclosed space, which allows a moment. She described it as needing to be there to offer a vivid experience, sharp observation, and a place for contemplation. And that idea of finding a place which is both grounded and growing is at the heart of what I think we're all trying to do with Ruskin, finding our texts that Ruskin has offered us. So I want to finish with one final text and to give us encouragement to go out for the next 50 years of Ruskin studies and to try and embody some of the things that Ruskin himself carried with him: his magnificent enthusiasm, his unselfishness of sacrifice, and finally a profound sympathy with the fullness and wealth of the material universe. Thank you very much.